Hello everyone. Today we are going to present you one of the most controversial topics, which is American foreign policy toward the Israel and Palestine conflicts. Our topics today consist of Israeli-Palestinian conflict background, American interest in the dispute, how the United States been involved in the conflict, the U.S. position on Palestinian statehood, the U.S. position on Jerusalem, how much U.S. aid goes to Israelis and Palestinians, what are the prospects for the resolution to the conflict. Israelis and Palestinians have had conflicts regarding the claim over the Holy Land for decades, a conflict that has been one of the most world unmanageable disputes for a long time. Even though the United States is a strong supporter of Israel, it has generally attempted to promote a diplomatic solution that would appease the controversial claims of the two sides. There has been the proposed solution, which are the two-state solution and the one-state solution. The one-state solution refers to a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the creation of a unitary, federal or confederate Israeli-Palestinian state, which would include all of the present territory of Israel, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and possibly the Gaza Strip and Golan Heights. Whereas various American administrations have proposed two-state solution for a peace process by establishing two states for two peoples, which are Israel for the Jewish people and Palestine for the Palestinian people. However, critics say the hope for a two-state solution seems to have faded under Donald Trump's presidency, who implemented a slew of controversial policies regarding core components of the conflict. The administration of Joe Biden has reversed some of those changes but left others in place, including Trump's decisions to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Beginning with what is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict about? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a century-long territorial fight over the Holy Land, a Middle Eastern region with great religious and historical significance to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The increasing numbers of Jews start moving to Ottoman Palestine, which was a mainly Arab region after the 1896 publication of Theodore Herzl's The Jewish State. This encouraged the idea of a haven for Jews in their ancient homeland to escape anti-Semitism in Europe. Also, the migration massively increased after the Holocaust of World War II, in which Nazi Germany killed 6 million Jews. In 1947, after years of Arab-Jewish violence, the UN General Assembly voted for the establishment of two states in Palestine, one Jewish and the other Arab. Shortly after, the Jewish community in Palestine finally declared independence of the Israel state, creating a country on May 14, 1948, stimulating hundreds of thousands more Jews to immigrate, and driving a war launched by neighboring Arab states. For their part, Palestinian Arabs say Jews have been able to take over their originary ancestral homeland from the help of Western powers, including the United States and the United Kingdom. Furthermore, they claim Israel's establishment and its defeat of allied Arab armies in the 1948 war as the Nakba, or catastrophe, which the United Nations estimated killed more than 700,000 Palestinians. In the decades since, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute has continually turned into massive fights, including multi-state wars, armed uprisings, intifadas, and terrorist acts. However, a major turning point was the 1967 Six-Day War, which ended the Israelis' occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza. In its aftermath, the UN Security Council used the Resolution 242, which aimed for Israel to withdraw from the occupied lands in order to defend and recognize the borders in exchange for peace. Still, the resolution lacked details, but the resolution nonetheless was a breakthrough, which became the basis for future diplomacy to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Nowadays, the region is home for around 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and 3 million in the West Bank. Though most of Israel's 9.2 million residents are Jewish, there are around 2 million people who are Arab citizens. International diplomatic efforts to deal a political settlement have created limited improvement. Next, more recent, the United States-led diplomacy has focused on fixing several main issues, including borders, Jerusalem, refugees, security, and the mutual recognition. Firstly, borders. The concept of having two separate states, which are Israeli and Palestinian, generally meant to the two-state solution, has had crucial international support for decades. It would form a Palestinian state that contained most of the West Bank, with land swaps to compensate it for Israel's absorption of some Jewish settlements there, and Gaza, which only Israel withdrew from in 1925. Most international diplomacy encouraging a two-state solution leaned to Israel returning to the period of its pre-1967 borders, but there is no agreement on how doing so could illustrate the Palestinians within those borders and Jewish Israelis living beyond them. Secondly, Jerusalem. The disputed city overlaps the border of Israel and the West Bank. However, Israel has seized the whole city as its capital. Meanwhile, the Palestinians claim East Jerusalem for the capital of their state. The two-state solution would actually need a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Thirdly, the refugees. The wars in 1948 and 1967 created a large number of Palestinian refugees, which was 1 million. The survivors and their descendants, which mostly live in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, they claim their right to come back to Israel, which got support by the 1978 UN General Assembly resolution. However, the debate is carrying on whether survivors' descendants should also be recognized as refugees with that right or not. Meanwhile, Israel views the right to return as a threat to its existence as a Jewish state, and believes the refugees should go to the Palestinian state that would be created as part of two-state solution. Fourth, security. Israel sees some Palestinian militant groups as existential threats, especially Hamas, which is the Islamist organization that controls Gaza and has taken an oath to knock down Israel. Islamist organizations provide even suicide bombings and rocket attacks, usually aiming for Israeli civilians. Therefore, Israel deeply wants these groups to disarm and the Palestinian state to be demilitarized, but expects the Palestinians to still have a strong police force. Meanwhile, the Palestinians aim for the abolition of Israel's military occupation and want full authority over their own security, but accept the limitation on their arms. On the other hand, Israel wants to keep the capability to operate in Palestinian territory against threats to its security. Fifth, mutual recognition. Each side aims for the recognition of its state by the other, as well as by the international community. To explain, most Jewish in Israel want to see Israel granted as a Jewish state. In contrast, Palestinians want Israel to accept their forced displacement under the Nakba. 6. The end of the conflict. Generally, both sides want a peace agreement that would end their conflict and embrace the claims of each side, and eventually lead to the peace and normalization of Israel's relations with all Arab states, as provided for in the Arab League's Arab Peace Initiative. Next, we are going to talk about what are the U.S. interests in this dispute. The Middle East has always been of central importance to the United States. for a long time, as the role of many administrations seek a broad set of interrelated goals, including security, crucial energy resource, driving away Soviet and Iranian influence, guaranteeing the survival and security of Israel and Arab allies, countering terrorism, encouraging democracy, and decreasing refugee flows. For that reason, the United States has attempted to sort out the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been a main force of regional dynamics, with a focus on gaining these strategic goals while balancing its support for Israel and pushing for broader regional stability. At the same time, the dispute has been a major concern of the American Jewish community and Christian evangelicals that both of them are the strong supporters of Israel. Nevertheless, some experts say U.S. interest in resolving the conflict has diminished in recent years after the start of Arab Spring in 2011. Other regional conflicts such as wars in Syria and Yemen, Iran's push for dominance in the region, and terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the self-proclaimed Islamic State. These created more immediate threats to the U.S. interests. Besides, U.S. relations with Iran and the Arab Gulf states no longer seem to depend on Israeli-Palestinian issues, causing the conflict less prioritized, according to the former CFR fellow Philip H. Gordon, who worked on Middle East peace negotiations at the White House during the Barack Obama administration. In addition, in January 2021, Gordon was appointed Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President Kamala Harris. U.S. interest in the Greater Middle East also decreased as other regions gained priority, as emphasized by the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. Later on, the Trump administration reignited controversy over the disputed region by backing up Israel on several matters, breaking with decades of U.S. policy aimed at serving as a neutral broker in negotiations. The Biden administration has so far signaled that it will promote equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians, rather than focus on resolving the overarching dispute.
How has the U.S. been involved in the conflict? For more than half a century, the United States had played an important role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It became involved shortly after World War II, joining the United Kingdom in a 1946 inquiry that recommended 100,000 Holocaust survivors relocate to Palestine, which would be neither a Jewish nor an Arab state. In 1948, the United States was the first country to recognize Israel as an independent state. Following the 1967 Six-Day War, the U.S., together with the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and the United Nations, attempt to mediate the border Arab-Israeli conflicts. However, it was the 1973 war, in which Israel struggled early on to defend itself against invading Egyptian and Syrian forces, that compelled the United States to take the lead in future diplomacy. Although Israel won the conflict militarily, the Arab powers delivered a major psychological blow. The war was also a major turning point for U.S. foreign policy in that it made Arab oil producers to impose a harmful oil embargo on the United States, and it brought the United States, which supported Israel, and the Soviet Union, which armed Egypt and Syria, close to a nuclear confrontation after a period of detente. The Arab League recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, as the only legal representation of the Palestinian people in 1974, which was a benefit for the Palestinian cause. Following the fighting, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger works as the main mediator between the Arab governments and Israel in the months that follow. In 1974 and 1975, his shuttle diplomacy between Middle Eastern capitals helped de-escalate the war and separate the combatants. In 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter hosted the Camp David peace talk between Israel and Egypt, which produced two frameworks that would lay a foundation for future Middle-East diplomacy. The first asked for Palestinian self-rule discussions involving Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. The second called for Egypt and Israel to sign a peace treaty, which they did in 1979 in the White House. Jordan, while being a party to the 1973 war, did not participate in the discussion for fear of being condemned by the other Arab countries. In 1994, Israel and Jordan signed a separate peace deal. Despite the fact that the U.S. was excluded from the Oslo Peace Accord negotiations in 1993, under which Palestinian leaders recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized Palestinian autonomy in Gaza and the West Bank. The disputing parties signed the final agreement at the White House. The United States and the Bill Clinton administration played a larger role in 1998, when it sponsored negotiations between Israel and the PLO that led to the Clinton parameters for the establishment of a two-state solution. Since then, its administration has suggested its own two-state solution. George W. Bush Roadmap to Peace, Secretary of State John Kerry's Sixth Principle, and Donald Trump's Peace to Prosperity. While attempting to negotiate a compromise between the parties, the U.S. had sheltered Israel from international criticisms, which some argue has harmed diplomatic efforts to end the war. Since 1970, the United States had used its veto power as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to block resolutions censoring Israel dozens of times because it sees the United Nations as a forum that is biased against Israel. Since 1980, the U.S. has only allowed the Security Council to punish Israel for settlement developments once in late 2016 when the Obama administration withdrew from voting on the issue. According to many experts, Trump had abandoned his duty as an honest broker between Israel and the Palestinians and has taken an optimized posture. In August 2020, the Trump administration mediated an agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, known as the Abraham Accords, in which the two countries pledged to begin normalizing ties. Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco later announced similar U.S. brokered deals. Normalization opponents claim that these steps violate the Palestinian clause, mentioning the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which said that Arab League countries will only normalize relations with Israel following the foundations of a Palestinian state, among other requirements. The Biden administration viewed the accords as stated that it will encourage other countries to seek normalization with Israel, but stressed that such agreements are not a replacement for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Following days of increased violence in which Israeli airstrike damaged targets in Gaza, and Hamas and other Palestinian militant organizations fired rockets at Israel. The Biden administration reportedly works behind the scenes to help Israel and Hamas reach a ceasefire. Biden reaffirmed the United States' support for Israel's right to self-defense, while also promising humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. Timeline of Israeli-Palestinian relations. 1947 UN General Assembly Resolution 181 calls for Palestine to be divided into Jewish and Arab states and appoints the city of Jerusalem as a separate entity. 1948 Israel says yes to UNGA Resolution 181 and declares its independence. It fights off armies from nearby Arab countries that oppose its existence. UNGA Resolution 194 establishes Palestinian rights of return. 1967 Responding to a mobilization by Arab states, Israel launches preemptive strike and captures the Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. UN Security Council Resolution 242 enshrines the lands for peace, vision that becomes the basis of future Arab-Israeli negotiations. 1973 During the Third Arab-Israeli War, the United States backed Israel against a coalition of Arab states attempting to recover lost territory, arrange a ceasefire, and launches the U.S.-led peace process. 1978 to 1979 U.S. President Jimmy Carter hosts Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begins at Camp David, where they lay out a framework for peace in the Middle East that includes Palestinian autonomy. After further negotiations, Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty. 1987 to 1993 The First Intifada leads to widespread violence, resulting in the death of several hundred Israelis and nearly 2,000 Palestinians. 1988 Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat accepts UNSC Resolution 242 as the basis for Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. 1991 The Madrid Conference, co-hosted by the United States and the Soviet Union, opens negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians for the first time. 1993 Secret Israeli-Palestinian negotiations held in Norway result in the Oslo Accords, which call for the withdrawal of Israeli troops in stations from the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinian self-government. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. 1994 Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty brokered by the United States. 1995 The Oslo Second Accords established Palestinian self-government in Gaza and 40% of the West Bank. 2000 Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader, attend a Camp David conference organized by U.S. President Bill Clinton to address boundaries, settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem, but no compromise is reached. Clinton lays off the group work for an independent Palestinian state that coexists peacefully with Israel. 2000 to 2005 After the failure of the 2000 peace process, mistrust on both sides through the Second Intifada which kills 1,000 Israelis and over 3,000 Palestinians. 2002. Following the conclusions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab Peace Initiative offers Israel peace and restore relations with the Arab world. Following terrorist strike inside Israel, the Israeli army retakes control of Palestinian-controlled territory in the West Bank and begins construction of a security barrier around East Jerusalem settlement block. 2003. President George W. Bush of the United States proposed a roadmap to cease violence and relaunch Israeli-Palestinian discussions, ultimately to the creation of a Palestinian state in 2003. 2005. Israel pulls out of Gaza, including out of its colonies. President Bush acknowledges the existence of settlement blocks in the West Bank in a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. 2008 to 2009. Israel declares war on Hamas as the Palestinian militant group starts missile attacks on Israeli citizens from Gaza. Over 1,000 Palestinians and 13 Israelis have been killed in the weeks-long conflict. 2013 to 2014. The Obama administration relaunches Israeli-Palestinian final status discussions, but the talks fall apart due to differences over settlements, the release of Palestinian prisoners, and other concerns. 2017. President Donald Trump of the United States announces the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the city as Israel's capital. 2018. The U.S. cuts bilateral aid to Palestinians, and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, closes the Palestinian Liberation Organization's office in Washington, D.C., and opens its embassy in Jerusalem. 2019. The Trump administration acknowledges Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and expressed its opposition to a decade-old State Department opinion that Israel West Bank settlements are illegal under international law. 2020. President Trump set out his plan for Israeli-Palestinian peace, which includes Israel annexing 30% of the West Bank and a smaller Palestinian state. Later, his administration negotiates agreement with a number of Arab states in order to normalize relations with Israel. What is the U.S. position on Palestinian statehood? Biden has stated that the United Nations will continue to support a two-state solution, which advocates for separate Israeli and Palestinian states, with borders similar to those in place prior to the 1967 war. This region includes the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and sections of East Jerusalem. The Clinton parameters provide the outline for the establishment of a Palestinian state and the resolution of the other final status issues. George W. Bush became the first U.S. president to openly support a Palestinian state, which was outlined in the United States, European Union, Russia, and the United Nations 2003 Roadmap for Peace. The Obama administration attempted to pursue a two-state solution as well, but talks collapsed in 2014 due to conflicts over settlements, Palestinian prisoner release, and other concerns. Based on the final status negotiation, Secretary Kerry offered ideas for a two-state solution in 2016. Trump's plan dropped peace to prosperity would have established a Palestinian state, but given Israel's sovereignty over an essentially undivided Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Holy Site, delegating the Palestinian capital to a suburb of East Jerusalem. The plan did not offer Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes, but it did offer $50 billion in investment in a Palestinian state in the making. According to the conceptual map included in Trump's plan, when Israel took the Jordan Valley and all of its settlement there, Palestinian territory in the West Bank would drop to 70%. The plan, which was drafted without consulting Palestinian officials, had been called a success for Israel on all important final status issues by critics, while the Palestinian Authority or PA had rejected it. Despite its long-standing support for a two-state solution, the U.S. had traditionally refused to support Palestinian statehood ambitions at the UN, claiming that this issue should be resolved exclusively through negotiation with Israel. Since 2011, the Palestinian Authority has wanted full UN membership for Palestine, a move that required approval by the Security Council, where the U.S. wields a veto. Although the PA has yet to secure enough support for its bid. 138 countries voted in 2012 at the United Nations General Assembly to recognize Palestine as a non-member observer state. What is the U.S. position on Jerusalem? When the United Nations General Assembly decided in 1947 to divide British-controlled Palestine into Arab and Jewish governments, the city of Jerusalem was recognized as a corpus separatum or separate body, reflecting its shared religious significance for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The newly founded State of Israel, on the other hand, established its capital in the western half of the city and eventually seized East Jerusalem from Jordan in 1967. Israel subsequently essentially annexed Jerusalem by expanding its municipal body to include surrounding Palestinian communities. Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization or PLO agreed in the 1993 Oslo Accords, the last comprehensive accord on the subject that claimed to Jerusalem would be settled only in the final status negotiations. Today, Israel considers all of Jerusalem to be its capital, whereas the Palestinian Authority claims East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state, and consider Israel's occupations of the region to be illegal. For decades, the United States and most other countries that have relations with Israel kept their embassy in Tel Aviv so as not to preempt a future peace deal, despite the fact that in 1995, the United States and law required the relocations of the American embassy to Jerusalem. Consecutive presidents have waived the requirement to defend the United States national security interests. Trump, on the other hand, chose to move the embassy to Jerusalem and recognize the city as Israel's capital in 2017. Supporters of the plan said that there was no national security reason to delay the move and that U.S. diplomatic representation in Israel should be situated in the capital of the country. Palestinian leaders have made peace with the Trump administration as a result of the decision. Despite the fact that President Biden has rebuilt their relations, he has stated that the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem will remain. Biden also stated that he intends to reopen the Palestinian missions in Washington, and the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, which were both closed by Trump. However, it will be tough to do so. The Palestinians are prohibited from having a mission in the United States under a 1987 law that Trump's predecessor violated, and the Trump administration passed legislation to prevent future leaders from waiving the limitation.
What is the U.S. position on Israeli settlements? Soon after the 1967 wars, Israel began building settlements in some of the territories it had held. Settlements construction started under Labour Party governments, aiming to strengthen its defense in part of the West Bank. To explain, the West Bank has seen fighting during the Arab-Israeli wars. Nevertheless, it increased rapidly, as some settlers regard the land as their religious and historical right, and others saw economic motivations to live there. By 2019, 600,000 Israelis live in the settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And this is how each U.S. president deal with Israeli settlements. For years, the United States officially blamed these settlements, branding them an obstacle to peace, while avoiding outright naming them illegal to avoid Israel's charge of international sanctions. Also, a 1978 State Department legal state that the Jewish settlements in the occupied regions are not administrable under international laws. However, in 1981, President Ronald Reagan noted in an interview that the settlements were ill-advised but not illegal. Moreover, George H. W. Bush was the first president to link the amounts of aid that Israel would obtain to its settlements building, subtracting the cost of settlements construction from the U.S. loan guarantees. However, Clinton later permitted exemptions for settlements building in East Jerusalem and for natural growth. In 2004, George W. Bush wrote a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, acknowledging that the new realities or settlements would make it impossible for Israel to reverse to pre-1967 borders in any peace agreements. And most administrations believe that the Israel would maintain its three largest settlement blocks in exchange for surrendering other land to Palestinians in any peace deal. To explain, they thought it unrealistic that Israel could force so many of its citizens to depart the settlements. While the Obama administration handled to shield Israel from political movements that aim to penalize Israeli businesses functioning in the West Bank, it also condemned Israel's settlements by refraining from the UN Security Council's vote, declaring the settlements illegal. As it did with other components of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Trump administration pivoted to a view of pro-Israel Jewish settlements. In November 2019, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said to disagree with the 1978 State Department's opinion, stating, "Civilian settlements in the West Bank are not per se inconsistent with international laws, and not an obstruction to the peace process." The announcement provoked more than 100 members of Congress to sign a letter of disapproval. Then CFR fellow Gordon reported that if there was already a yellow light from the United States for settlement expansion, Trump administration just turned it green. Trump peace plan, Israel would have emerged about 30% of the West Bank by expanding sovereignty to all Jewish settlements and to the Jordan Valley. On the side of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was expected to move forward with annexations in July 2020, a proposal charted by the U.S. lawmakers from both major parties, including human rights experts and leaders worldwide. Nonetheless, as part of Abraham Accord with the UAE, Israel agreed to suspend annexation temporarily. Currently, during Biden presidency, the Biden administration has not prioritized the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on its foreign policy agenda. However, shortly after the ceasefire in Gaza was announced, Biden declared that he spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu 6 times in a few days. Consequently, this process was lower profile than 2012 and 2014 U.S. engagements, when the Obama administration sent Secretaries of State Clinton and Kelly to regions to bring about a ceasefire. Nevertheless, reports indicated that the last few calls were characterized by firm and clear warning to Netanyahu. This reversed the Trump administration's strategy of maximum space for Israel. Clearly, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman recently stated that a Trump administration would have provided Israel free range to defend itself. How much U.S. aid goes to Israeli and Palestinians? The United States has long been Israel's supporter, and it's creating a security collaborator since the United States helps the existence of the Jewish state. During the Cold War, many U.S. defense strategists noticed Israel as the best companion in the fight against Soviet power in the Middle East. Later, it was confirmed to be a solid contributor to U.S. counter-terrorism efforts. Today, Israel stayed the U.S. closest strategic partner in Middle East. Also, both countries are concerned about Iran nuclear ambitions and its aids to Islamist militants like Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Hamas. With their shared interests, the United States has committed to help safeguard Israel's military superiority over any harmful combinations of countries. By law, the U.S. government must guarantee that any arms sold to other Middle Eastern states do not adversely affect Israel's qualitative military aid over military threats to Israel. The United States started delivering Israel with military assistance after it departed from Arab territory as part of peace process. Washington believed that it was a responsibility to supply this security aid as Israel took risks for peace. The United States also provided large aid package to Egypt and Jordan in exchange for their commitments to the peace process. The United States has supplied many incremental foreign aid to Israel, compared to how much it gives to any other country since the end of World War II. In details, the United States gave Israel significant economic aid from 1971 to 2007. However, due to Israel's large economic growth starting in 1990s, it currently acquires primary military aid. In 2020, more than half of all U.S. foreign military aid was given to Israel, which operates most of it to buy U.S. arms. Furthermore, the United States is committed to supply about $4 billion to Israel each year, including $500 million for missiles defense under 2016 Memorandum of Understanding. The United States also supplies aid to Palestinians, primarily to help government and humanitarian programs. To illustrate, Washington gave more than $5 billion between 1994 and 2018. Since 1950, the U.S. has also delivered more than $6 billion in support to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, or the UNRWA. In 2007, aid flows were restructured after Hamas broke violently with the PA, led by the rival Fatah party, and seized control of the Gaza Strip. The United States regards Hamas as a terrorist organization and carried measures to ban it from receiving assistance. U.S. aid to the Palestinians started shrinking under the Trump administration in 2018, as it lessened assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, and also stopped the assistance to UNRWA. In 2019, Trump signed an anti-terrorism law that permits Americans to sue recipients of the U.S. foreign aid, including the PA, over alleged conspiracy in acts of war. Even though the anti-terrorism law remains in effect, the Biden administration has continued aid to West Bank and Gaza. The pending congressional approval of some funds is still in process, and this could amount to more than $360 million in 2021 for economic help, pandemic-related assistance, funding through UN agency, and humanitarian aid after the recent Israel-Hamas conflict.
However, some security experts and political analysts state that the country has quietly cultivated and may have obtained practical autonomy from the United States. Within Narang, a Massachusetts Institute of Technology political scientist who has studied Israeli strategy, said that we are seeing much more Israeli independence. Hence, some believe that Israel no longer needs American security assurance to protect it from neighboring states. With it has mostly made peace. Israel also does not see itself as requiring American mediation in the Palestinian conflict, which Israelis primarily find bearable and support maintaining as it is. Also, Israel currently produces many of its most essential weapons domestically. Moreover, it has become more self-sufficient diplomatically, developing allies independent of Washington. Culturally, Israelis are less sensitive to American approval and put less pressure on their government to keep good contact with Washington.
Then, what are the prospects for the resolution to this conflict? The perspective of Israeli-Palestinian negotiation is unfortunate. It is improbable that the Palestinians will receive concessions from Israel that are more profitable than those that the Palestinians have rejected in the past. Some experts have indicated that the change of the two-state solution will continue to be vanished, particularly if the Israeli government annexes settlements in the West Bank and Jordan Valley actions it's consented to suspend as part of Abraham Accord with the UAE. Many analysts also mention that the recent Arab-Israeli normalization deals and the 2021 Israel-Hamas conflict have decreased the possibility of new talks between Israel and the PA. Meanwhile, the political divisions between Hamas and the PA stay a challenge to any further reconciled settlements. Some experts say this dynamic have increased the prospect of a one-state outcome, with many views as risky given the chance that Israel will no longer be a Jewish state with Arabs, including at least half of the population. And if Israel were to restrict Palestinians' equal right to stay a Jewish state, that would damage its future as democracy. Despite this concern, there is a growing interest in the concept of one-state solution. It has become more popular among Israelis, and a 2020 poll of Palestinians revealed that just over one-third would support it.